It is January 1944. Britain is at war. And in a darkened room in Portsmouth, a charismatic Scottish woman sits motionless in a chair, draped in black, with a crowd of desperate strangers watching her every breath. Then something moves. A white, shapeless mass begins to pour from her mouth. It stretches, it rises. And according to the people in that room, it takes the shape of a human being. A whistle blows. Lights flood the room. Police pour through the door. Britain was about to prosecute a woman for witchcraft in the middle of the 20th century. This is the story of Helen Duncan, a mother of 6, a traveling medium, the last person imprisoned under the British Witchcraft Act of 1735. And depending on who you ask, either a gifted psychic so dangerous the government locked her away to protect the outcome of World War II, or one of the most brazen fraudsters in the history of British spiritualism. The truth may be somewhere the official record cannot reach. Victoria Helen McFarlane was born on November 25, 1897 in Callander, a small town in Perthshire, Scotland. From an early age, she was different. She made dire predictions to classmates. She spoke of things she had no way of knowing. Her behavior unsettled her mother and terrified her schoolmates, who gave her a nickname that would follow her for life, Hellish Nell. After leaving school, she worked at Dundee Royal Infirmary. In 1916, she married Henry Duncan, a wounded veteran of the First World War who believed in his wife's abilities completely. By the late 1920s, they had 6 children and very little money. Henry encouraged Helen to turn her gift into a profession. She transitioned from basic clairvoyance into physical mediumship. Her séances did not simply involve voices or vague messages from the dead. They involved physical manifestations, things you could see, things that took up space in the room. The centerpiece of her séances was ectoplasm. Ectoplasm was a term used in early 20th century spiritualism to describe a substance supposedly produced by mediums during contact with the spirit world. White, gauzy, semi-transparent. In photographs from the era, it appears to pour from the mouths and nostrils of mediums, sometimes resolving into recognizable human shapes. At her séances, attendees were sometimes invited to examine her body beforehand, confirming she was concealing nothing. She would then enter a trance. Her spirit guide, known as Albert, would speak, and then the ectoplasm would come. The material would emerge from her mouth, take on human shapes, and sitters would claim to recognize dead relatives in those forms. For people who had lost children, husbands, and brothers in a world consumed by war, the pull of that experience was immeasurable. By the late 1920s, Helen was one of the most sought-after mediums in the country. However, not everyone was convinced. In 1928, a photographer named Harvey Metcalf attended séances at the Duncan home. His flashlight photographs showed something troubling. The spirit child, a figure Duncan called Peggy, appeared to be a papier-mâché mask draped in a sheet. In 1931, paranormal researcher Harry Price brought Duncan into his National Laboratory of Psychical Research for controlled séances. Price had certified genuine mediums before. He was not simply a debunker. But after testing Duncan, he concluded the ectoplasm was cheesecloth, swallowed, and regurgitated. When investigators prepared to X-ray her, she fled the laboratory into the street and had to be physically restrained by her husband. Her supporters argued that this was not the reaction of a guilty woman. They argued that exposing a genuine medium to invasive examination could cause serious physical harm, and that Price had come in determined to find fraud. Will Goldston, one of the most celebrated stage magicians in Britain, attended her séances and publicly stated that what he witnessed could not be explained by any system of trickery he knew. He said it directly and on the record. During a séance in 1933, someone grabbed one of Helen's materialized spirits, a little girl called Peggy who regularly appeared in her sessions. The lights went on. Peggy was revealed to be a white cotton undervest. The police were called in. Duncan was prosecuted and fined £10. 2 months later, she was recertified by the Spiritualists' National Union and was performing again. Whatever else was happening inside those darkened rooms, Helen Duncan was not easy to stop. When World War II began, her demand grew dramatically. Across Britain, families were losing sons and fathers and brothers at a pace that defied comprehension. Helen Duncan worked Portsmouth heavily. Portsmouth was the home of the Royal Navy, a city that lived in permanent expectation of catastrophic news. In May of 1941, she was leading a sitting in Edinburgh when a spirit delivered shocking news. A British warship had sunk. Among the audience that night was Brigadier Roy Firebrace, Scotland's chief of military intelligence. His position gave him access to classified information. He had heard nothing about a sinking. After the séance, he checked. HMS Hood had recently been lost in the Battle of Denmark Strait with over 1,400 men. He reported the incident to intelligence services. Then in November of 1941, at a séance in Portsmouth, a figure appeared wearing a sailor's uniform. The cap bore the name HMS Barham. The figure communicated that his ship had gone down in the Mediterranean. HMS Barham had been torpedoed by German submarine U-331 on November 25, 1941. 862 men died. The British public did not know the ship was gone. The Admiralty had deliberately suppressed the announcement. Letters of condolence went out quietly to the families of the dead under strict requests for secrecy. The official announcement would not come until January 1942. So how did she know? Skeptics argue that secrecy around a loss of that scale was never truly airtight. Nearly 900 families received letters. Each of those families knew other people. Word spreads. A medium working a naval port city who spent her time with grieving military families had many possible sources of information that required no supernatural explanation. But no source was ever identified. No chain of information was ever traced to her door. No sailor was ever named. The path from the Admiralty to Helen Duncan's séance room was never established, not then and not since. The Royal Navy began watching her. They kept tabs on her for 2 years. In January of 1944, 2 naval officers attended a Duncan séance to observe. During the sitting, a white-shrouded figure appeared claiming to be the dead aunt of one of the officers. He had no dead aunt. Another figure claimed to be his sister. His sister was alive. He reported the séance to police as fraud. 5 days later, on the night of January 19th, a plainclothes officer planted in the audience at a spiritualist venue in Portsmouth blew a whistle. Officers came through the doors. They grabbed for the ectoplasm. The room was searched. In the chaos, nothing was found. It did not matter. Helen Duncan and 3 co-defendants were arrested. The initial charges were under the Vagrancy Act. But the case was referred upward. And there, someone reached back 200 years. Section 4 of the Witchcraft Act of 1735 made it a criminal offense to fraudulently claim the ability to summon spirits. It had not been meaningfully used in over a century. It was now being deployed against a Scottish medium in the middle of World War II. A simple fraud charge would have been easier to prosecute and carried a shorter sentence. The Witchcraft Act meant a jury trial at the Old Bailey and up to a year in prison. Historians have noted the timing. D-Day, the Allied invasion of occupied France, was being planned for June of 1944. It was the most consequential military secret of the war. Whatever Helen Duncan knew, whatever she might say next from behind the curtain of a séance room, the British government was not willing to find out. Locking her away was the simplest solution. On March 23, 1944, Helen Duncan stood in the dock at the Old Bailey. Her defense produced 41 witnesses, doctors, clergy, men and women who swore under oath they had witnessed genuine contact with the dead. The defense asked the judge to allow a live demonstration, a séance in open court in front of the jury. The judge refused. The prosecution presented the photographs, the laboratory reports, the analysis of the ectoplasm material. The jury was walked through the case for fraud step by step. When the guilty verdict was returned, Helen Duncan collapsed in the dock and cried out, "I have done nothing. Is there a God?" She was sentenced to 9 months in Holloway Prison. Even Winston Churchill was disturbed. He wrote a memo to the Home Secretary calling the prosecution obsolete tomfoolery and demanding an explanation for why a law from 1735 was being used in a modern court of law. His memo, however, did not stop the sentence. Helen Duncan served 6 months and was released in September of 1944. She promised the court she would conduct no more séances. She was performing again within months. Police raids followed her from city to city. Charges were dropped for lack of evidence again and again. The Witchcraft Act of 1735 was repealed in 1951. Her case had made the old law indefensible. A woman who never claimed to be a witch had been imprisoned under a witchcraft statute, and the country had noticed. In a strange way, Hellish Nell changed British law from a prison cell. In late 1956, police raided a séance Duncan was conducting in Nottinghamshire. Officers entered without warning. She was thrown into shock. A doctor found 2 unexplained second-degree burns on her stomach. Her supporters believed the violent interruption of her trance had caused physical damage that no standard medical explanation could account for. She died 5 weeks later on December 6, 1956, in Edinburgh. She was 58 years old. After her death, her husband acknowledged having witnessed her swallow objects before seances. Her personal maid confirmed purchasing cheesecloth on multiple occasions. The physical record of her career points strongly toward fraud. And yet questions remain. The researchers who investigated her most carefully were never fully comfortable with a clean verdict. The London Spiritualist Alliance, after dozens of controlled sittings, published a split conclusion. Some investigators found fraud, others refused to sign on to that finding entirely. Their report noted that while staged materials were clearly present on some occasions, certain moments during the sittings resisted easy explanation. One researcher asked a question that has never been cleanly answered. If everything Helen Duncan produced was fabricated, why would someone capable of the subtler, more baffling phenomena also resort to doll heads and cheesecloth? If you can do the impossible, why risk the obvious? It is not a question that proves anything, but it is a question that stays open. The Scottish Parliament rejected pardon requests in 2001, 2008, and 2012. Her conviction stands. She was the last person imprisoned under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. The British government never explained why they chose that law. They never explained what they feared she knew. They never explained why a medium who had been fined £10 for fraud in 1933 required a jury trial at the Old Bailey in 1944. Something made Helen Duncan different from every other fraudulent medium working in Britain at the time. Whatever that something was, it has never been put on the record. Subscribe to Paranormal Depths for the strangest and most compelling cases from around the world.